Good afternoon, my friends. It is February 6th of 2015. We're going to take a look at an extremely unique work of scholarship. It goes back to 1997 by an author by the name of A.N. Wilson, a biographer living in London at the time, and an individual who started out studying for the ministry and then dropped out after 1 year. A professed atheist for years, and during this writing he professed to be an atheist, but in 2009 he converted to Christianity and dedicated his life to Christ. And so we're really going to be looking at a work that I consider a transition piece. It's a piece that convicted him during the research and actually made a difference in his life, and I think helped lead him to that decision in 2009. So I look at him as at the writing of this work as a Christian in process, and someone who's getting a lot of illumination through this research, which eventually led him to a decision. And it is on Paul, the Apostle Paul, and it's from a biographer's point of view. So it's a secular look at his life and trying to locate the historical Paul as best he could. And I have to admit that myself as a Christian, I was very impressed with the work because it gave me a good grasp, a better grasp of Paul, and it prepares me better for the study I'm involved in, which is the book of Acts. And this really is a work that he centered on the book of Acts, and a few of Paul's epistles, but mainly the book of Acts. So we're going to take a look at this. It's broken down into two parts. We're going to look at Paul's Jerusalem, because that's where Saul begins before he receives the Christian name Paul. He begins in Jerusalem. So we're going to begin by looking at Paul's Jerusalem, what kind of environment he was being educated in, because primarily Jerusalem for Paul was his education time, his time to do his graduate work, get his master's in Pharisee studies. Gamaliel, the Pharisee, was his instructor in Jerusalem, and considered a elite Pharisee sage and teacher, and Paul studied under him in Jerusalem. So we're going to look at that context first. We're going to look at the education background, the environment Paul emerged from, and then we're going to look at the conversion experience, which is central to the book of Acts. It gives a lot of attention, but we're also going to look at the years of silence that followed when Paul took up a voluntary exile back to Tarsus. So Paul had a very unique conversion experience. It didn't happen overnight. It included a 10-year process of reflection and integration of the unveiling event on the road to Damascus. So we need to look at that 10-year period of internal self-conscious reflection as well. And then we're going to look where he landed, which he did not land in Jerusalem. We're going to look at where he landed as far as his ministry. And we know that his home church was Antioch of Syria and remained his home church throughout his ministry. But he did not land in Jerusalem, where he was educated. He ended up going about 350 miles north to a large city, the third largest city in the world at the time, Antioch of Syria, and he ended up basing his mission work out of that fellowship. So to begin with, let's take a look at his Jerusalem, and when we do, we're going to notice that part of the obvious environment in Jerusalem at the time was the temple, which this was it's often referred to as the Second Temple period. It's a temple that was built by Herod the Great in a way to kind of appease the Jewish citizenship because Rome expected Herod to maintain order, and the best way to maintain order is to make some compromises toward the Judaic faith, as long as they're willing to make some compromises toward the emperor worship. They both did, and there was kind of a hands-off policy that was going on at the time, and they just kind of left each other alone, and that way Judaism was not horribly persecuted in the way that Christianity was, but Judaism did not have a very severe persecution at the time. And Herod did build the temple, but that was considered a contaminated temple because it was the Roman, obviously Herod built it, it was the Roman temple in a way, and many of the purist Judaic followers considered it a contaminated and defiled temple. But if we look at the temple, which is central to the environment Paul was being educated in, the administration of the temple consisted of a high priest, and the high priest was not elected out of the Judaic fellowship. The high priest was appointed by Roman government. So you can understand why it was considered a contaminated temple, a defiled temple. The high priest was appointed by Roman government. And then the Sanhedrin was the administrative senate, and it was made up of a hierarchy of Sadducees, and the Sadducees were, the best way to understand them as followers of the law of Moses, who were fundamentalists. They were living by the letter of the law. They would be, in our day, we would call those people fundamentalists. They were the fundamentalists, and completely at odds with the Pharisees, who were not fundamentalists, but believed in interpreting the law and being more open to revision, to interpretation. The Sadducees allowed no openness to revision of interpretation. They were strict fundamentalists, and they were the governing senate of the temple. And then the high priest actually had a temple guard, and the ideal for Rome was maintain order. We don't want any uprisings. The temple guard was to maintain order, especially during festival events like Pentecost, when you had thousands and thousands of people gathering around the temple guard maintained order. And that meant keeping Gentiles out of the inner court, because there were two courtyards for the temple of Herod. There was the outer courtyard, which was for the Gentiles, and also for the purchasing of sacrifice-type animals and money changers. This is where Jesus flipped over the tables. It was in the outer courtyard. Then there was the inner courtyard, which was exclusively for Jewish believers, where they would go through the purification rite on festival days or those mandatory days when you would take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and then go through the purification rite. And there were many days or events like that, but basically you have to be familiar with the Jewish calendar of mandatory festival dates, which I am not familiar with. But those were the times when they would have pilgrimages to Jerusalem to go to the home temple, which at this time was the second temple period, the temple of Herod. Now also in Jerusalem at the time, the religion of Christianity had not yet been formed, and there were various ideas being posited, and the first century was a time of kind of allowing Christianity to gel together with all of its various elements that had been posited. It was just now coming together, but one group that was dominant in Jerusalem was the Ebionite Christianity group, and this was headed up by James, the brother of Jesus, and that was the fellowship in Jerusalem at the time of Paul. It was the fellowship headed up by James, the brother of Jesus, known as James the Just. He was considered a very very dedicated Judaic believer and very high ethical standard. And the Ebionites believed in voluntary poverty, so they took a vow of poverty. They would give away more than they would keep for themselves. They were a very, very dedicated Judaic order of believers who had converted to Christianity but didn't want to just absolutely abandon a Judaic faith that they had given their life to in a very intense, dedicated manner. I mean, these were very, very dedicated spiritual people. No one looked down on James. They really did praise James. He was nicknamed James the Just. But these were Christians that still did not want to totally abandon something they had given their lives so intently to. And so they were a Judaic version of Christianity, the Ebionite Christianity of voluntary vow of poverty. There were 5 aspects of this group. They did believe Jesus was the Messiah, but they believed that he was not divine. He was Messiah, but he was the anointed Messiah at the baptism by John the Baptist, but he was not a divine being. He was the anointed Messiah. So they believed he was Messiah, but not divinity. They did not believe in the virgin birth, and they only followed one gospel, and that was the Jewish gospel of Matthew, with the exclusion, of course, of any virgin birth narrative. But Matthew was the only gospel that they trusted. They separated themselves from the temple because they considered it defiled and corrupted, because it was under the Roman oppression. And so it was not the liberated temple of Solomon, and they still had the hope that one day the Roman temple would be overthrown and that the true Jewish temple would be erected. So they considered the temple of Herod to be defiled. They considered Paul as being apostate. Here's Paul going back to Jerusalem after his journeys and always reporting to James and to Peter, but here's James heading up a large fellowship of Ebionites that considered Paul an apostate, someone who had defiled the faith. They did not look at Paul favorably, and so he automatically had that opposition from fellow Christians whenever he went to Jerusalem. So Paul had a very difficult environment even at the home church in Jerusalem. Now the Gamaliel school, synagogues were not places of worship. Synagogues were schools usually run by Pharisees. There might be a Sadducee synagogue, but primarily they were run by Pharisees. The Pharisees were the teachers, and Gamaliel was a superior sage instructor, a superior interpreter of the law, and Paul attended his synagogue. There were 3 major fields of study that he taught. Number 1, Sophia, which was the study of the wisdom of the law, the divine wisdom. And then the Grammateus, and the Grammateus was the discipline of properly interpreting the law, or what we would call hermeneutics for their day. It was a class in hermeneutics. What are the principles of interpreting the law? And that's what you had to go through to become a scribe. A scribe was an interpreter of the law. And then third, they were also educated for debate and for possessing an expertise in debate and rational argument concerning the interpretation of the law. So they had a very thorough education. Paul was instructed in the Sophia wisdom, Grammateus interpretation or hermeneutics, and Sudzetesis, the methodology of debate and rational argument. And these took place in the synagogues that were schools. But Paul, of course, brought his heritage from Tarsus with him. And in Tarsus, which was a Greek culture, they worshipped savior gods in Tarsus. Greek was the primary language. Paul's thinking was always formed in Greek concepts. We need to remember that. his thought patterns were always within the Greek language structure. And Roman roads were, the Roman Empire did have a road project and an aqueduct project, but there were Roman roads that connected Tarsus to Ephesus and to Corinth. And just north of Tarsus was Antioch of Syria, and that was going to end up becoming Paul's home-based church. And that was just north of Tarsus. So Tarsus was kind of right in the middle of Antioch, Syria, and Jerusalem. Very unique position to be. But that was the Jerusalem that Paul received his education in. He had the influence of the temple that he had to deal with. He had to deal with the Ebionite Christianity. But Gamaliel truly did instruct him in three specific influential areas. And not the least of all would be hermeneutics, the grammateus, the principles of interpreting the law, which would be very important and play a major role in Paul later when he is converted to Christianity. Next, we're going to take a look at that conversion and on the road to Damascus. Okay, we look at the conversion experience. After the conversion experience on the road to Damascus, Paul ends up employing a hermeneutic of reversal. The divinely given Torah, after this experience, becomes a curse for Paul. It is not the source or the core of salvation. It's more of a indictment and a reminder that we cannot live up to the law, and Torah becomes a curse. That we have a fallen nature, and we cannot live up to that Torah. And the Roman crucifixion ends up becoming, of all things, a blessing in which Paul glories. He gloried in the crucifixion, took it upon himself because he understood fully what the suffering Messiah stood for. And he did adopt a new mind theology, and he developed this through what our author tells us was the mythic habit of mind. The mythos was myth, but we need to understand, an author, you cannot use the term myth unless you're going to define it, and because it can mean so many things. The author says that all he means by myth is it's a posited living reality believed to have once happened. So it's your positing of the truth of salvation as you see it, and you posit that truth as a narrative of something that did occur, but is alive and living currently as a power towards salvation. It is a living narrative. So, not at all what we sometimes think of when we think of myth. He uses it as a functional term. Now, the process that Paul went through is he would draw out the mythical implications of prophecy in the Judaic faith, and then he would construct a wider, universally encompassing myth that would include the Gentiles, that would target a salvation that was beyond the narrow Palestinian Judaism. So that was primarily his method, was to universalize the offer of grace through Jesus Christ. Now, after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the Pharisee Judaism continued, while the Sadducee Judaism tended to die out. Fundamentalism kind of died away, but the Judaic believers, the Pharisees, the schools that were all along willing to allow Gentiles to enter in and to study, they continued there because they were more universal in their thrust. So the Pharisee schools didn't die out, but Sadducee fundamentalism pretty much died out after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Now, Paul's mythologized Jesus passed through three separate stages. First, it became an interior thing in the vision experience on the road to Damascus, and then by reflecting on and internalizing that event, it became an imagined thing as Paul worked up his notion of the truth of this event and what it meant for him and what it meant for the world of believers. And then it became a written thing because we find out that after Paul is under house arrest in Rome, he becomes a prolific writer. And so this mythologized, mythical, living narrative becomes written, and it becomes a written narrative that can change lives. And so it does pass through those three stages, but eventually it will become a written, living narrative because Paul becomes the writer as he's under house arrest in Rome. Now, after his conversion experience, Paul ends up traveling a great deal, but his traveling is a traveling of discovery. He's traveling through various urban areas and being involved in a debate in the schools and a continued learning process. And you need to look at this as a relearning process. He has to relearn his Pharisee training now through the interpretive filter of Jesus of Nazareth as the Christos Messiah and as the Kyrios Lord. So he has a re-education process that he goes through. The author calls this the wilderness years. In a way, it's like wandering in the wilderness, only it's a wandering through the urban areas of the outlying Gentile nation. Now, the concept of Messiah is not the Jewish anointed king. It instead becomes a power that is made perfect in weakness for Paul. And Paul does withdraw from the rabbinic schools at this point, and like I said, is working through a re-education from the point of view of Jesus Christ. He travels through the Arabian cities of Ammon, which is Philadelphia, Jerash, and Petra, and then he travels to Peter and James in Jerusalem, and then he's off to Tarsus, where he remains for approximately 10 years. Now, his concepts that he develops for this new mind theology that evolves is dikaiosune, righteousness, becomes a quality possessed by God, and it is dispensed by God or withheld from humanity. So it's either dispensed or withheld according to God the Father's sovereignty. Agape love is God's love for the elect, not mankind's love for God. So again, the emphasis is on sovereignty. And faith is a person's attitude in God's presence of complete surrender of the will, surrender of the mind, and surrender of the heart. And free will didn't much exist for Paul. Human will was really always in subjection to the sovereignty of the all-powerful God. So Paul did not have a very high marks on human free will. He felt that God's sovereignty overruled everything. God's sovereign plan of salvation was a determinism as far as Paul was concerned. Now, Paul did consider his Damascus experience a mysterion, or a unveiling mystery of the truth, of getting closer to the purposes of the Creator God and the God that offers salvation. So it was a mysterion. He involved himself in these wanderings, which were peripateo, and that means they were wanderings to define life. The wanderings had a purpose of what does it mean to be saved, and how do we define an authentic life? So they were a peripateo wandering. And then he continued in debate at Sudzeteas. He continued in debate wherever he went, wherever he wandered. He first went into a synagogue. He went into the school in that area and would train, lecture, debate, and continue his education, but from a new point of view. He ended up with basic axioms of his new mind theology, that we were in the end time, the Messianic age is near, and this destiny is linked to Jesus of Nazareth. It's an all-Jewish movement, but the Jewish inheritance is not given to Jews alone. That's the key for understanding Paul. It was still considered an all-Jewish movement of salvation, but the Jewish inheritance is what gets altered for Paul. The Jewish inheritance goes out through the Jews to the Gentiles to the furthest end of creation. So inheritance gets qualified, and every believer can penetrate into the inner temple courtyard in Paul's New Mind theology. Every believer can penetrate into the inner temple courtyard. And in Antioch of Syria, in that temple, Gentiles could enter into the inner courtyard. So in the Antioch home church, Gentiles entered the inner courtyard. In Jerusalem, they would be under threat of death if they did something like that. It was absolutely not allowed, punishable by death. But in Antioch of Syria, Gentiles had the privilege of also being allowed access to the glory of God, the doxal glory of God through Jesus Christ. Now, interestingly, Wilson brings it all together in this block of the benefit of spiritual division. And this is really important to understand because we always think about Rome and the evolving or the emergence of the Christian faith in Rome, but for Wilson, Christianity evolves or emerges out of a tension between two home churches, two fellowships. It's the tension between Antioch and Jerusalem. After the death of Stephen, the Jesus movement split, and the fundamental split eventually evolved into two main centers of faith: the Jerusalem faith of the Ebionites and the Antioch of Syria believers who allowed Gentiles into the inner courtyard. Antioch was 350 miles north of Jerusalem, and some people say the book of Acts was written by Luke to heal the split between Jerusalem and Antioch. I disagree. I think Acts was written as a bridge between the gospel according to Peter and the New Mind theology of Paul, which he developed in Philippi, and I believe Luke is writing to Philippi. So I take that approach. I think the bridge between Antioch and Jerusalem was a saint. I think it was Barnabas. I think Barnabas is the bridge between the two fellowships. Barnabas was praised highly in the Ebionite fellowship. He was considered one of those that was up for vote on replacing Judas Iscariot. And Barnabas went with Paul, ministered to the Gentiles, so he was equally praised in Antioch. So for me, the healing bridge between the two fellowships is the true Christian saint Barnabas. Now we look at a key factor. When you look at these two fellowships, the key pivotal point is the divinity of Jesus Christ. The Ebionites did not believe in the divinity of Christ. This doctrine began to evolve in the Hellenist Christianity in Antioch, and it showed up very early in a quoted hymn that was quoted in Philippians 2, 6 through 11. And the Greeks had a very keen reference for any kind of incarnate God or incarnate deity, because their Greek mythology of Dionysus was an incarnate deity. So they had a frame of reference, and they had a better way of understanding this truth than, say, the Ebionites would have. So the divinity of Christ is born, the divinity of Christ, that doctrine is born in Syria of Antioch, that fellowship, not in Jerusalem, not in Rome. It is born in the Hellenist Christianity of Antioch. Now the concept of Messiah becomes more internal and more universal in Antioch than in the Ebionite Palestinian Christianity. And for the Antioch believers, Jesus had great appeal to them because he was a healer. He was a teacher that taught with authority, not as a scribe. He was a martyr. The manner of his death also triggered them. And Simeon Niger was one of the leaders in Antioch, and guess what? He's the man who helped Jesus carry the cross during the crucifixion. It was this man, Simeon, who ended up becoming one of the leaders at Antioch, who helped Jesus carry the cross. Paul clearly disassociated himself from the Ebionites and James and attached himself to Antioch. Antioch was the third largest city in the world, surpassed only by Athens and Alexandria. And the Pharisees' synagogues did thrive, so Paul always had teaching platforms, and Gentiles were equally welcome already in the Pharisee synagogue schools. So we see a very definite benefit of the split, because we actually get the emergence of the divinity, the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus Christ out of the Antioch fellowship. We see a bridge through a true, gracious, holy saint named Barnabas, and he ministered in the Ebionite fellowship and was praised. He was up for vote for the replacement of Judas Iscariot's episcopal bishop place, and Paul equally praised him. So he's the bridge as far as I'm concerned. The book of Acts is really written as a bridge between Peter's gospel and the New Mind theology that Paul developed in Philippi. The very first written documentation of the divinity of Christ is a hymn that Paul included in the letter to the Philippians. And this is when he starts doing all his writing after his house arrest in Rome. He does a couple years of ministry of writing living narratives that can change lives. These living narratives are what the author calls muthos, or muthos aletheia, truth through myth. But it's a different understanding of myth, okay? It's not Greek mythology. It's really just a posited living narrative concerning the plan of salvation through Jesus Christ. It's the muthos aletheia. So I think the author gives us a beautiful look at the biography of Paul. He began being educated in Jerusalem by the experience of the Temple of Herod, the Ebionite Christianity, and the Gamaliel Synagogue School. He goes through the conversion experience, and then he goes through wilderness wanderings, but they were really wanderings through urban areas, and also a withdrawal, a voluntary exile of 10 years to back to Tarsus, where he could relearn, re-educate himself through the filter of Jesus Christ as Messiah and Lord. And then finally, we find out that he lands in Antioch, and that there's a huge benefit of this split of fellowship. After Stephen, there was the Antioch of Syria fellowship and the Ebionite fellowship in Jerusalem headed up by James. That tension was healthy. That tension caused people to do research and educate and to grow and to learn. So it actually ended up being a beneficial tension that caused a great depth of learning and the emergence of new doctrines. And that'll wrap us up for this biography of the Apostle Paul.